Well, good afternoon. My name is Chuck Evans, and I'm joined by David Tinsley, my associate, and we're with Lenders Cooperative. We are a national lender service provider. We have our own loan operating system, and we provide the platform for the SBA through Summit Technologies. And we're here today to bring a 30 at noon webinar series. And the purpose of these webinars is not to replace the trainings that NADCO provides or NAGL provides or even the SBA training on demand. It's to bring you industry stakeholders that have used best practices, talk about issues, and spend 30 to 45 minutes of just sharing their knowledge. And we're fortunate today to have Jessica Conn from Starfield and Smith. And I was saying, Jessica, I think we closed our first loan together in 2010. She doesn't look like it, but certainly has been around for a while. And this is special because you're going to get probably 45 minutes of advice from an attorney without a bill. So we're excited to have you, Jessica. Um, let's talk, David, Jessica. Let's talk. We talked 2 months ago with Lindsay about emerging risk. And the Office of Credit Risk Management has said that numerous times. We've had record levels of SBA lending, but along with that has come some concerns that there is more defaults, more delinquencies, and more guaranteed purchases. What do you think, Jessica? Am I
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. No, we definitely have seen an upward trend. Interest rates going up and then kind of sustaining at these higher levels have certainly impacted the businesses, and liquidations have gone up, collections have gone up, and guarantee purchases have definitely gone up.
And I think your associate Ethan Smith told me once that, with record levels of SBA lending, Starfield and Smith has record levels of closings. But the interesting thought that he mentioned to me was the fact the workouts, liquidations, and guaranteed purchases, the mix has changed drastically, which tells me that there's more activity in your shop as a result of this. Am I right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely saw a very clear shift. And even when you still have lending, good lending, you just see those trends with the interest rates and the businesses that are struggling through this time.
Great. Well, we're going to record this webinar, so what you'll have it. We're going to send it out, the PowerPoint out, so we'll have this memorialized. So anyone that's joined or cannot join, we'll make sure you get access to it. So anything else, David, before we get started that you can think of?
Well, I would be curious, when you mentioned the fact that you've seen a change in the mix of these, is there anything particular that just stands out high level there as far as in that change that, given the increase in the volume like you've described, was there anything you weren't expecting? I'm just right here at the top.
Um, Not necessarily. Well, I'll say this. I think that we kind of have seen two things. We saw, the interest rate change, but then this also corresponded with the change in the regulations that happened in August of 2023, and now how those are being interpreted. So we'll get into a little bit more specifics on that here,
Okay.
but I think that there has been a shift in that way as well.
Okay. That's what I was wondering. I just don't want to lead the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that.
A lot of lenders, because of this emerging risk, just don't know how to handle the loans in this sector. It's always a focus on business development and booking loans. And now we're in these times, it's all that more important to have the right staff. And again, Office of Credit Risk Management had said to me, some of the things that they've seen is that lenders are using attorneys that aren't versed in SBA, and that can get you in trouble. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
and the I know we're talking collections today, but that is a huge area for us because a lot of these collections attorneys, they are used to being able to do certain things in conventional lending that you really have to be careful with and may not align with what you can do on an SBA loan. So definitely areas where you have to kind of look out, make sure that you're talking to people who know the traps and know how to protect the guarantee.
As a,
Yeah. Hey,
as
Chuck.
in, David,
Let me also bring up this, since you're the one that mentioned the free, legal advice. We can utilize the Q&A here for the chat. If you have a question that's going along with it, please enter that. I'll be monitoring, and we'll make sure that we can get that question and at least bring that up for discussion. Sorry to
That's
interrupt.
awesome. No, that's okay. But we've run across lenders that just aren't versed in this, and they've submitted a package, and there's been some war stories you probably could share with us, isn't there not, Jessica?
Oh yeah, I've got stories. I've got stories. Well, and I did want to mention too, the slides that you're going to see kind of talk about the package itself and then some of the changes that we have seen in the package since 2003, and then also it was recently updated. The UPP was recently updated in December of 2024. But we got a really great question right before this, and I wanted to just mention that because it's a good conversation to have. And that question was, if you had a guarantee that was denied, what are your options? And so I wanted to go through that a little bit because it's not covered in the slides, but I think it's an important question to discuss.
Very.
So if I can take a step back and talk a little bit about the process, it's really important to kind of understand once you submit a UPP to the Purchase Center, who's looking at it, where is it going? So I'm going to take Herndon for an example, even though Herndon doesn't review all of them. Some of them are reviewed at, Little Rock. But if you're in Herndon, you're going to have this package that's going to go through, and it gets reviewed at certain levels. And the whole time, a lender really has a lot of contact typically with SBA at that point. You have a person you can talk to. They're asking questions. You can ask questions. And Herndon will then make recommendations. They don't have the authority to actually deny a loan guarantee, but they can recommend that it gets denied. And so if you're getting to this stage, they may even give you a heads up ahead of time. But if they don't, they will issue a letter or an email that says, we're recommending a denial for these reasons. And they'll give you a little outline of the reasons. If you want to continue the process and you're not going to kind of stop it there, the file then goes to headquarters. Headquarters is the office that does have the authority to actually deny a guarantee. And again, there is a review process at that level. And again, you do have access to a person typically and can have some discussion and back and forth with them. Once you get through their final process and headquarters says, we're done now, we're going to actually deny this guarantee, that is a final denial. And it's a much, much more difficult situation, possibly even impossible. It really kind of depends because once the file is through headquarters, if it's not paid and it's not resolved, at that point you're going to the Office of General Counsel. You're going into litigation with SBA. So that's not a situation you necessarily want to be in. And the reason why I mention this is because if you're going to try to work with them, try to explain these situations that you're in, and try to kind of appeal any decisions that they're making at those first stages, the recommendation stages, it's very important that you do that early on. If you're going to engage or discuss this with outside parties, outside counsel, get them involved as early as possible, because once you kind of hit those later stages, there's much, much less opportunity.
Good to know. And how often have you seen lenders that just accepted it and moved on? Quite often?
It depends on the scenario. I mean, once you're in guarantee purchase, the facts matter a lot. So it really kind of depends on what's going on.
Okay. David, any thoughts from you?
No, I just think that's sort of critical. I think most of the SBA world boils down to really making sure you have your ducks in a row before you go on to the next step, because you sometimes only have, especially when it comes to presenting information to SBA, you only get to present it that first time, the one time. And so it's always difficult to start back from a, no, it's not what it looks like. Like that's a terrible place to be in, at least, Jessica, so maybe that's kind of what you're thinking. So if there's doubt early on, I would think if there's genuine concern and you want to reach out to someone like Starfield, or that would be the time. I absolutely agree.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think another thing that I find with the clients that we have is, the UPP asks for certain information, but sometimes that information doesn't tell the whole story. And so it's sometimes worthwhile to give a little bit of context, and, throw a memo in there along with the documentation that they're asking for, to kind of say, here's the context, here's what we were doing, here's why we were doing it. Because ultimately you're going to be asked those questions anyway if it's confusing. So you may as well be proactive about it and try to get ahead of
Right.
it.
We're basically at the end of the loan process on this step. And so the last conference or the last webinar that we talked about, and Okram had said that when they've gone out, they've seen lenders haven't been proactive in managing the portfolio, waiting too long to do things. And so that's something I just want to reinforce, file review. How many times have you gotten to where you're taking it over and you've looked at the file and it doesn't have the assignment of life insurance, or it doesn't have this and it doesn't have that? And that just makes it all the more difficult in achieving what you want to achieve.
Absolutely. I mean, I have heard some lenders who actually, once they close out their file, they would organize it. This was back with the 10 tab, right? But probably UPP too. They organize it in that order. And I think there are things like that that kind of make you to start thinking, oh, what are the missing pieces here? What are the things that maybe we should have gotten ahead of time and that we could work on now as you're doing your kind of post-closing reviews and things like that. So I
Right.
do think there's being proactive is, hugely helpful.
Waiting till the loan goes past due, but following the SBA portal, the score, the Redwood score. And if you see your portfolio starting to degrade, then now's the time to get in there and start looking at things to make sure when it gets to Jessica's step that you've gotten all your T's crossed and your I's dotted, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, you want to get
Right.
started?
Yes. Yes. All right. Let's see. Okay. So the order of these slides, well, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background. So along with the changes that we saw in the SOP 5010 when the 7 was issued, right around the same time, we also now had a new system with the UPP instead of the old 10 tab system. And this was great because it created this universal system. So you didn't have to have a different way of organizing files if they were small versus the larger ones. And this was based on what was the old PDK system for the smaller loans. But I found this to be hugely helpful because you're really looking at the same types of documents for every file and organizing them in the same way. But what's important to know is that the UPP actually was updated in December of 2024. So it's same cover sheets, but there's different questions here and there, just some is clarification, some is new information. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that tab by tab. The other thing is, if you've been lucky enough to not be working with these yet, that's great. But if the PDF itself is dynamic, so you really want to be careful with how you're answering the questions and answering them accurately, because it does impact how the rest of the PDF kind of develops and what questions it's asking you to complete. So it's important to pay attention to that. So general loan information, this covers tab 1. And what I think is interesting about this tab is it has a lot more comprehensive information than like the 10 tab system did, asking about kind of the status of the loan. They want to make sure that what you have done is aligned with what you told them that you were going to do in E-Tran. So there's all these boxes that you kind of have to go through and really think about the answers to these questions, check the boxes that apply to your loan. And ultimately, I would consider this to be essentially making certifications. Like these are the things that you're telling SBA you did or didn't do in accordance with this and kind of setting the stage. So again, accuracy is key. And also making sure that you've gone through each one, because if you are, skipping through questions, I would expect that they're going to come back and ask you to give them that information. So you want to avoid any potential delays by kind of taking the time ahead of time to get through that. The loan summary, so this is tab 2. And I wanted to raise a couple points about this because of the change that was just made now in December. Okay. Now, when a loan is being charged off in connection with submission of a UPP, this was always the standard that any charge off, you're going to complete what they are calling here an SBA assignment form. And what that is that you're assigning any of your rights remaining in the loan documents or any judgments over to SBA. What's changed here is that they've now added this piece that I copied in that picture that says attach evidence of recordation for remaining collateral, including mortgages, deeds of trust, and judgments. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this because I've kind of had this come up in a few different ways. There's a little bit of confusion around this concept. So um, in the charge off tabs, which are still sometimes used if you're not charging off at the time you're submitting this, there is a tab, I think it's two, I'm not sure, that asks a few questions, and you have to give it a yes or no answer for all of these questions. One of those questions is there a possibility of recovery? Now, what that section says is if you say no, if you say yes, if you say yes, you're not ready for charge off. And why this is confusing is because if we have remaining collateral, like a remaining mortgage, then technically we do have the possibility of future recovery, right? And there hasn't really been a clarification that I have seen yet about this issue. And so we get questions a lot of times from clients saying, well, I have this scenario and we have a residential mortgage. There's not a lot of equity there, but there's a little bit. And, our guarantors do live there. So do we have to actually go ahead and foreclose on their house before we can submit our purchase package? And the answer to that question is the standard attorney answer. It depends, right? So there's a lot of factors, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you just kind of a clean, this is always going to work answer. But what I will say is there are certain scenarios, and you can kind of look at the SOP and look at what it says about hardship and kind of giving you guidance as to when it is or is not appropriate to foreclose on a house. But there are certain scenarios where you may not want to or may not be able to foreclose on the house, but you don't necessarily want to abandon either, because the distinction between hardship and not foreclosing because it's going to create a hardship for your guarantor versus abandoning that collateral, those are two different things. And this is an area where I have seen lenders get in trouble. I had one client come to me because they said, "Oh, we had these residential properties, and now the SBA is going to repair us because they said that we weren't supposed to abandon these assets, these properties." And the first question I asked them was, "Well, when you say that you abandoned them, did you actually release those mortgages?" And they said, "No, no, no, we didn't release them. We just didn't do anything with them. They're still sitting on the property. And, if they were at some point to sell those properties, that mortgage would have to be paid off. So, potentially we could still even have a recovery from that, even though this is a loan that they've charged off." Well, I said, here's the thing. You didn't actually abandon that property, right? You just didn't do anything with it. So I went back. They said, "Okay, well, I want you to look at this file." So they gave me the file. And I went back, and all throughout this package, they had told SBA, "Oh, we abandoned the property. We abandoned the property." And I said, "Well, this is the problem. SBA thinks that you've actually abandoned this collateral and you didn't. We need to fix this, and we did. And so, there's not a clear rule here, but I think that there are certain circumstances where you may end up leaving collateral. You may even be able to still charge it off. And then you just have to kind of pay attention to it. And if you receive any proceeds from that property down the road because it gets sold or whatever, then you submit that as proceeds to SBA if your guarantee was honored."
Jessica, ask us in 30 days because we have a new client last month that came in with this exact same scenario where they
Mhm.
hadn't foreclosed on the house and they submitted for the guarantee purchase.
Mhm.
We'll see.
Yeah. Well, and I have seen situations too where a lender might say, "Oh, it's we're not going to foreclose," and they submit it with that, and then the SBA comes back and says, "No, we think you should." So
Well,
again, there's
Jessica,
not a lot of guidance.
let,
Mhm.
let me ask you. So you're talking about answering a question, saying is there a possibility of recovery or future any additional recovery there? Is that effectively creating a sort of a bottleneck or a stop there? Because if you're stuck with this indecision, you can't really answer yes or no, right? I mean that
I think
and be able
ultimately
to
you do have to
proceed.
make it. Right. I think you do
Okay.
have to ultimately make the decision.
Okay.
And if you make it wrong, it kind of depends on which way you go with it. Right. If you say, like, we're not going to foreclose and we're submitting it, it's still there, they could come back and say, we disagree with your decision. You're not ready for charge off. We want you to foreclose. Um, I guess the opposite probably wouldn't be true. You're probably not foreclosing and then having them tell you that you shouldn't have, right?
You shouldn't have. Yeah. Okay. Because I know there's there's like a principle in accounting. It's this idea that you always follow the rules that you have unless the following of the rule actually creates something that would be past the point of it. So I mean, there are situations where SBA is saying follow A, B, C, and D, that's clearly outside of the spirit of that letter,
Hmm.
and so I think, and obviously every single time that you've got a liquidation, when you're dealing with something like this, it's because it didn't go right. So
Right.
there's bound to
Exactly.
be just nuances that are truly unique, and all the effort spent trying to put together these packages, you're still going to have something that question answering it accurately actually is going to mislead the reviewer. And
Hmm.
knowing how to handle with that is, that's kind of the guidance that you're talking about. I
Right.
really, how do you communicate that? Because you have to answer the question, but is there some way to be able to say, I'm answering it this way to be clear, this is what I'm meaning? I don't know if there's a best practice for that, but that would be the
I
question.
think it's what you're discussing. I mean, I think it's kind of you give your answer, you give your context, and then you know that this process is a back and forth. There is an opportunity
Right.
to talk to them, yeah. So the next tab, this is tab 3, and this includes the transcript of account. Not a lot new here. I just wanted to throw out there that there is a question on the cover sheet here about section 1112 payments. I know we are all done talking about COVID, but in SBA world, or at least in my world, we are still
Please.
not. um, so make sure you're really looking at that. That is something they look for. And you want to kind of go through and answer that question accurately. Um, Loan transcript summary. This is really, it takes time to get through this piece and answer these questions, but it's really, really important. Gives a lot of great context when you're kind of reviewing a file. And I know that SBA needs responses to, as many of these as apply to really do their job. So make sure you're kind of covering that too. Tab 4, early default. So these two changes, I honestly, I think this is more of clarification. I don't think this is really a change, but they've added language as of December that says if you have equity, to make sure you include your equity injection sourcing and your standby agreement. I would have done that anyway, personally. If you're in that scenario, I always want to kind of put out as much information as I can. But the one thing I will say about the guidance changes in the other SOP 5010 7.1, is there's still kind of a lot of confusion, or at least maybe not a lot of clear definition about the requirements here. So again, kind of thinking through your process, thinking through what your standards are on similarly sized loans, is going to be important to how you're approaching this and how you're answering this question, or whether it was required. Um, so that's just something to keep in mind.
Is there a difference of do what you do versus do what you should do as far as the equity injection?
I mean, on the closing side, I do still think, because there's not a lot of definition in those sections, that it's a best practice to document them fairly thoroughly,
Yeah.
because you don't want to get caught later. A lot of this stuff, it'll end up being that, well, here we are and we don't have contact with these people and there's really nothing we can do to get this information. So, on the closing side, you never want to think that your loan is going to go bad, but if you kind of are expecting that's a possibility and thinking, if I had to document this and submit this to a purchase center now, what would I want to include in my file? I mean, that
Yeah.
that would be how I would want to think about that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Um, Tab 5 is about business eligibility, and the original changes, now that we have the UPP, was that it just kind of keeps this really simple and streamlined, and I love this, but it'll say, does your applicant have affiliates? And if they do, include your affiliation analysis. And I think that's great because it kind of gets right to the point. And you kind of can even just indicate that there's not an affiliate if you need to, and then you just move on. So very helpful to kind of look at it from that perspective. The new change from December is that they're now asking for a Form 159 and a Form 601 if those were applicable. So again, even though at this point, right, you're well beyond disbursement, you're well beyond all that, but just goes to show that things like a Form 601 are really, really important to have, because even all the way down this line, they're going to want to make sure that that is in your file. Tab 7 goes through all the obligors, right? So your borrower and your guarantors. And this looks a little different than it did in the original 10 tab. So even now, we still kind of see a little confusion from our clients on this section. So I wanted to mention that, for starters, make sure you're always doing a separate cover sheet for each of them. It's when you're completing it, you kind of get through, you put your borrower in, and you think, oh, I can move on. No, you need to add a separate cover sheet for each of your guarantors and your borrowers. The other thing, actually a couple things here, what you didn't have in the old system, in the old 10 tabs, was this concept that you need documentation to verify this social security number or EIN. So, I would say, again, they're not really giving specifics as to what you need, but do try to find something in your file that shows that this number was used somewhere. A little easier with corporations or LLCs because you can just throw that SS4 in there. But, copy a first page of a tax return is great if you have that. Something just to show that you knew this number was accurate when you were using it for like CAVers and whatnot. The other one would be these SAM searches. I get this question all the time. I hope that everybody's getting their SAM searches, but if you're not, please do, because this was not in the original 10 tabs. They weren't asking for these, but we do need to include them in the UPP. So it's been, I think I've seen a lot of people have to kind of button up their process a little bit more and make sure that they're getting these so that they can be putting them in their UPPs as well. And then as of December, they added this next one, bankruptcy documentation. I think that was just kind of closing the loop. I would think that they would want to have that if your party was in bankruptcy. And I think it was maybe just not included, but now definitely want to be throwing something in there to support why you would not be referring to Treasury over a bankruptcy. So then the next tab, I think this would be tab 8 at this point, would be use of proceeds. This one, again, kind of a do what you do standard at this point as far as what documentation you specifically need. It does give you some guidance based on what your loan purpose was. And so I copied this change of ownership stuff, not because I'm going to go through it in real detail, but just to show that if you say on your package that it's a change of ownership, it'll populate all of these things and kind of give you guidance. And I believe this was one of the changes in the December update, that it even outlines more specifically for like a partial change of ownership. They're going to want to see business balance sheets for the current quarter, or how you met that requirement using an alternative standard. So it's just something to really kind of think about and keep in mind that, there's going to be certain areas where they're going to give you very specific guidance and then other areas where they're not. But I always try to think of this more from a practical standpoint of how do I demonstrate to SBA that the proceeds went where they were supposed to go, right? So give them the specific things they need and then anything else that they would need to see to kind of close those gaps and say, okay, yeah, we have confidence that the proceeds were used in accordance with what you told us that they were going to be used for. EBCOC I threw on here too because, again, they kind of gave it actually a little bit more clarity in this version, talking about the fact that you do need to have the subordination agreement or some kind of document showing subordination to the lender. Oops, I think I have this pop up. And they also want you to now show that any working capital disbursements that you made did not go to the EPC. So that is something that they're specifically asking for. And you want to make sure that you have something in there to cover that. Oops, I was off on one. Okay, collateral was the last one. This actually follows pretty closely, maybe format-wise different, but to the requirements of the older system. But one thing that they do talk about now that they didn't before was they ask you for the actual or estimated recoveries. Estimated recoveries, I think, can be kind of hard to figure out sometimes. So if you know it and it's clear, I think it's fine to put it in there. But I also occasionally will just leave that part blank if it's really not possible to figure that out in a reasonable way. Because if the loan is sold on the secondary market, you're doing this 45 days from purchase off the secondary market. That might be a number that you just can't really figure out at that point. But they do ask for support when there would be support to give, right? So like if you're in the situation where you have, release collateral or abandoned collateral, you do need to provide actual backup support for those actions. And that is kind of a newer, more descriptive way that they've addressed that issue now. Couple just little last minute tips here. The PDF that you use, it can be a little glitchy from time to time. So when I'm completing one, what I would like to do is try to kind of fill it out and print as I go so that I don't lose my work. I have had situations where we've lost some of the stuff that we've entered in. So just know that you want to kind of find ways to save that up by maybe printing copies. Right now, the ways to upload these files, they kind of changed it. We don't do send this file anymore. So you can upload through E-Tran, and they do ask that you send notification to them when uploading to E-Tran so that they know. The cover sheet itself says that you can email, although I think that if these tend to be pretty large, so I think email is probably not the preferred way to do this. And then secure transfer is going to be box.com at this point. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention, this is kind of taking it a different direction, not really the primary focus, but it's really critical. And so I didn't want to kind of overlook this for today's talk, is that right now what the SOP 5057 3.1 says is when they're reviewing for compliance, they are going to review based on the current standards first, unless those current standards are more strict than what they were in the past. So this has been an interesting area to kind of navigate in our world because, immediately when working on these files, I think they used to look at them and say, well, we have to look at what you were supposed to do at that time. We have to look at what you were doing back when you made this decision. And that's really not the standard anymore. So that does come up a lot. That does come up a lot in my work. And kind of, I'm going to call it appealing the decisions, but because they're not like final denials, I really engage more in those earlier discussions, responding to a recommendation of a denial and saying, well, wait a minute, I don't know that this is the right standard to use because we're going to use today's standard instead of the standard from the past. So just something to keep in mind and know that that's still something that I think that they're navigating as to how to look at it from that perspective, given that the rules are fairly different in some areas.
4 or 5 things like that that are giving lenders pause, just not knowing what to do and how to interpret it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jessica, let me ask then. So are you seeing scenarios, especially where items fall under that do what you do standard? Is SBA pushing back specifically on policies that the lender followed, like as far as internally? Or how are you seeing that play out? Just out of
Good question.
curiosity.
It kind of depends. Like I haven't had a situation yet where they have said, we're going to dive in and talk about your specific written policy. not to say that we couldn't end up there, right?
Right.
But I haven't seen it in that way. But the hard part becomes, how do we convey what the policy is and what kind of support do you need to show what your policy is? And what if it's not written? Like, what if it's not formal? Um,
Right, right. I understand.
yeah,
Do what you do. The best protection for that is to actually write down, this is what we do, and then do that. I mean, I
right.
realize that's ideal, but in the real world, nothing's ever perfect. It is what it feels like. So that's where I was curious that um, the standard you're then held to is this idea of, is it prudent? Is it reasonable? And I'm just curious, are you finding that in light of the fact that this do what you do is sort of encompassing all these other topics, is SBA's concept of reasonable, is that inching more toward a slightly higher standard? Are you seeing that harder, or are they actually being more lax in some of the items? Given you only, you present a picture of, this is all I know at the time when I did the loan. Is it reasonable what I did, versus now knowing all these other pieces? It's really hard to convey a picture, and the best way to protect yourself is, I was required to do A, B, C, D. I did all of them, but absent that, now having that ability, are you finding it harder, or is it just too soon? I just out of curiosity.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, because I think that it can it can be harder in some ways because it's somewhat subjective. But what I would say to that is, keep in mind too that a lot of that the timing of what we do kind of tracks with how loans have gone bad. So because the do what you do standards and how they are so heavily relied upon came really from August of 2023. Most of the files that I have done since then are not those files that were underwritten using those standards, right? They're
Right.
ones that were under the older
Right.
SOPs. So more focus for us has been on, well, whatever was done in the past, really we should be applying a do what you do standard instead of the standard that was done before, which is a different scenario than, well, we underwrote it with do what you do in mind. So I think there's still more to come on that. I think we're kind of almost a little too early to answer some of those questions.
So we had a comment that just came through, and I've heard this from others as well. But Nagel had recommended that at the time of the underwriting, that you actually list out which SOP is in effect at the time of it. So it's a clear reference to that. This was underwritten under this SOP, right? So
Mhm.
is that something is that helpful? Do you think? I mean, just little things like that. I think that's a low effort, high reward
Yeah,
sort
I
of
think
action.
absolutely. I think that's hugely helpful. And I will say, from the standpoint of somebody who reviews files post closing, to have that up front, and I have seen that, really just sets the stage for me to say, okay, now I know where to look when I'm thinking about why they made the decision that they made at that time. Absolutely.
After August of 2023, we review loan policy. You write loan policy. Have you seen most of the lenders in our space reviewing things and making changes since August?
I have, yeah. I definitely think that there has been a focus on trying to address that. Now, sometimes the changes aren't big, but I think that it definitely called for a review, called for a discussion, and kind of re-looking at what it is and making sure that it was something that they would be comfortable
Sure.
relying upon, and saying, this is why we did it. This is why we're this is why we're doing what we do.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Mhm.
good. Thank you. David, have you seen that as well with the clients that we have as far as reviewing loan policy, making recommendations, or they sticking with what they have?
I think some of the difficulty that a lot of our lenders are facing, and it's kind of two different ways. Number one, I don't think anyone's policy is ever exactly the way they want it, and so I think there's always room for improvement in that regard. But I think a lot of the SBA departments, they're struggling because oftentimes the do what you do is referencing something that is not even mentioned in conventional policy.
Exactly.
So and let's you and it's I think it's generally true to say this, and no offense meant to any group, because I think SBA is a mighty department in every bank, but it doesn't actually end up being able to influence a tremendous amount of policy writing for their greater organization. So what ends up happening is that you want general policy to be updated, and it's more or less a thanks, we're busy. It's kind of the way it can often feel. So I don't know, Jessica, if you have any thoughts on that, but I really, I think that's a common thing I'm watching. It's like you'll have to write some SBA policy because your conventional policy is silent to that. And so it's kind of hard to, how can you say you're consistent when there's nothing established?
No, I think that's right. I totally agree.
One last question. If everything in the submitting a universal purchase package or the whole process, how long does it take on a good day with everything well documented?
The perfect file, in other words. Right.
Perfect file.
Just
How long does it take a perfect file? I think
maybe
it
we
can
don't see
depend.
those.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
right. Well,
I don't
Depends.
know what that is.
that's probably true. I probably am seeing less of the perfect files, but um, I think part of it's going to depend on SBA and their volume as well. So
Yeah,
that's going to play a factor. But
which is
um,
increasing. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. But I would say, for a perfect file, if they're not completely overwhelmed, you know, it could be, it could be, 45 days. But I think there's a lot of reasons why that's going to vary, and there's a lot of reasons why that can get extended.
sure. Makes sense.
So this is a loaded question, and I realize that as I ask it. So, um,
David.
yeah. So is there, I mean, all lenders are wanting to make sure that their file is done well. I would think, is there some element of, if you present it, if your file is cleanly laid out, you've spent the extra time to tell a story as plainly as you can, so that you're dropping the breadcrumbs all along the way. Do you find that those get answered quicker? I mean, is it, reviewers are human? Do they pick them up and they're like, okay, I can get through this? Do you tend to see those more? You understand what I'm saying? It is like
Yeah.
sort of like, the neater it looks, perhaps someone's a little bit more willing to go ahead and finish that one up, versus that gets put aside. That's going to be a big mess. I'll get to it tomorrow. I'm just curious.
I think that there probably is some value to that. I wouldn't say that it's because they're trying to prioritize it, but I do think that at the purchase center, there is kind of a series of, kind of reviews that go through. And
Right.
so the better organized the file is, I do think it's just the easier it's going to be for them to look at it, and probably does get processed a little bit quicker. Yeah.
This is
Okay.
good. David, do we have
One
any
more.
other questions? Oh, good.
Not in the chat, but I've
I
got
mean,
one
it's
here
free.
so
Remember, she's not
right.
billing, so come on.
Yeah, but half the reason I really want to participate in these, just so I can ask my own questions, Chuck. But really, okay. So I guess let me ask you, along with the do what you do, and I know a lot of times it's just posing questions there. At a previous event, I want to say maybe it was America East. I think it was a panel that I participated in, but it was a presentation of, since I asked the question earlier, right? So if your policy is silent, in other words, your conventional policy where you're comparing to, in a sense, when you give yourself permission within your SBA policy, when you give yourself permission to do something, that becomes do what you do, right? Absent something else in the conventional policy, you're kind of, you give yourself that permission at that point. Are you finding, when it comes to presenting, or at least these packages that are submitted, is it better? Is there like an industry source that they can reference to strengthen the argument of what they're doing? And I know it's a really open question, but I think the last thing you want to do is to leave it entirely up to the SBA reviewer, right? Like, you almost want to, here's what we did, and obviously this is why that was the way to do it, right? So
Let,
internal policy is
yep.
strong, but I'm just curious, what are areas like that it would be better to go ahead and grab this versus leaving it open to interpretation? Are there any like high level, high impact, you think, if you're going to do it, at least do this? I don't know. That's kind of, I don't realize that's open. I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why, I'm sure you won't be shocked that the attorney wants things to be documented. Um,
Of course.
you know, because I've had situations, and this isn't even with the do what you do standard as we're talking about it today. Now, what SBA will say, and I believe that this is true, is that this is how they were looking at that concept before. But I think we talked about it less then. So, I had a file a while ago, well, earlier SOP, where the file was being denied for prudent underwriting. And it was, it's
Seen
such a challenging area to write on, because what are you basing it on? There's not really
Right.
a standard for that. And so we really had to kind of delve in and try to figure out, how are we going to describe this scenario and show that that this was objectively prudent when that's not defined. So, I'm not going to say it can't be done. I did it, but it's, just it takes a different kind of level of figuring out, that path. And so for that reason, so much better if it can be documented.
Well, this is good. We're getting close to the end of our 30 at noon. We're at 45 minutes. There's two important slides we're not going to bring up today because we've put that away, but they're the contact information for Jessica and for David. So should you have any questions, should you need any assistance, if any clarifications, please reach out. Next month, we're going to have our friend Edith Wiseman, president of Fran Data, to join us. And I know with the elimination of the directory, that's caused some issues. Jessica, has your firm had to do much more relative to franchise lending since they've done that?
We still have been getting a lot of questions about this area.
Yeah,
It's really, I think, in some ways, gotten a little bit more difficult to get comfortable with because
sure.
we don't have the
Yes.
database anymore. Yeah, absolutely.
David, how about you? We've seen that looking at franchises when you don't have that
Oh,
backstop that yet they had
yeah.
before.
I don't think anyone's ever complained about having too much information available when trying to go through and make a decision. So
Yeah.
absent clear guidance, do A, B, C, and D, you're then having to prove the steps you're taking up. And so, yes, definitely high value in making sure you're giving yourself quality information.
All right. Well, February 20th at 12 noon, you'll hear some more. Jessica, thank you so much for this. We
Oh,
really
thank
appreciate it.
you.
And David, good job.
Yes, thank you, Jessica.